So I want to do something rather different today. If you look at my ResearchGate page, you'll see a bunch of articles on geology that are in the last several years. And then way back, like 2004, you'll see my master's thesis, which is on dissonant counterpoint. And it was in music composition, music theory. And so I wanted to go through a little bit of the history of music theory today and just show you what I found as I was going through that. So music is very mathematical, and we know that just looking at the rhythm. Well, more fundamentally, it's actually based on math at the harmonic level. These are the ratios of sound frequencies that produce tones that sound consonant to us, that sound like nice, and that you can rest in, like just listen to that, and it's not going to you're not going to want it to move somewhere, want it to do something else. It just sounds like it could be the end of a song, for example. So I cut these pipes up this morning, and there's very specific ratios to the lengths of these pipes. I skipped this one because this is the inverse of that. Okay, so you can hear the dun dun. You can hear the octave there. This is the 3 to 2. So if you're da 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 dum, 5 notes apart, bum 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 bum, that would be a major chord. And then this is the 5 to 4 here. So with these three, you have the major chord, bum bum bum. So when we get to more complex ratios, they're dissonant. They're referred to as dissonant. And so basically, the simpler the ratio, the more consonant it is, and the more complex the ratio, the more dissonant it is. So it's wild that you can hear frequency ratios and know exactly what they are. With even people, like, you don't have to have any musical training. You don't have to, like, it's just built into your brain where you hear a ratio of two frequencies, you're like, oh, that's nice. Or it's like, or that's harsh and grating if it's a really complex ratio. Or the piano's out of tune and it makes it a very complex ratio. That's even worse, right? So it's just really interesting that that is built into our brains somehow to really appreciate this hierarchical structure of mathematical ratios in sound frequencies. Okay, so here we have, this is the 2 to 1 ratio, the 3 to 2, and the 5 to 4. So that's the foundation of all Western music right there. As the ratios get more complex, those two ratios right there, it's right there, it's that, and that. So you hear the difference. So we go from here to here, right? This is the most complex ratio on the keyboard, and it depends on how it's tuned. Those ratios are about 1% different from each other. And that is this right here. And that might not sound more dissonant than that, but if I do, so that's bossa nova. It's a Brazilian jazz, and I can get away with playing the ratios like 15-16 ratio in the jazz, but I can't get away with playing that ratio in the jazz. It doesn't fit. Like it's too much for even jazz. Oh, and also I told AI to generate all the pictures that you've seen. So if you play the piano, that might be bothering you as much as it does me. All right, so a little bit of history. This is a song. The first instance we have of the song, I think, is about from the 10th century. This is actually in our hymnal. It's in most of the hymnals that churches have, and it's in the Christmas section in our hymnals. of the Father's love begotten, ere the worlds began to be. He is Alpha and Omega, He the source, the ending, He of the things that are, that have been, and that future years shall see, evermore and evermore. So that's a chant called a plain chant or a Gregorian chant, and the monks would sing this in unison, no harmony. Sometimes they would add like one line on the bottom, and then they would kind of keep a drone perhaps kind of note on the bottom, and then the other monks would sing up and do the melody. One of the things that they were trying to do was preserve the intelligibility of the words in a big echoey cathedral. So they didn't want a lot of complexity in the music, because with all that echo, it's going to be very hard to actually just hear what's going on. So they would do these chants, and that was one way to combat that problem. But also, the music theory progressed a lot, which I hope you'll see as we keep going here. Okay, so jumping several centuries forward. This is 1562. This is Palestrina, and what I want you to hear in this one is that there's still very much of that chant type sound in the music, but now it's polyphony. Now there's 4 chants going on at the same time. The soprano, alto, tenor, bass are all doing something that sounds like a chant, and he's put those 4 chants together in a way that makes harmony. Hopefully you can hear how that chant, the plain chant, has been kind of pulled into this choral sound now. One of the things that Palestrina was trying to do with this Mass, we think, is he was trying to convince the Catholic Church leaders that this type of music was okay for a cathedral. It was okay for church service, because there was a lot of pushback against more complex music in the church. And so one of the things he was trying to do was show, no, you actually can hear all the words. This can be suitable for a worship service. 150 years later, this song was written about, and the date here is the date of the composition. By the time we get to Bach, Bach is a Protestant. He doesn't care what the Catholic Church thinks about chants or polyphony or anything. And Bach's a good Lutheran. And so he is trying to write. So what Bach has done by this time, what the composers leading up to Bach and J.S. Bach have done, is they've really codified how to write lines of melody and make them work with other lines of melody together to create harmony. They've really structured that study so that that's still what we use even today. That's like, you go to school to study music, and you learn what Bach did with harmony, and that's still the foundation. So there's much less of the chant influence, and now it's just like these are lines of melody, and we're making them work together very consistently to create something that sounds like Bach. This is a fugue. You hear how the melody came in again, but at a different, kind of in a different register. Melody again. So you can hear how that same melody line keeps coming back in over and over again, and then he takes it and develops it, and it's doing something interesting, but then he brings it back into a different part. And all of those notes, if you actually go and analyze that, he's thinking very carefully about which chords all of those notes are producing together. Okay, so then we get to Beethoven here. So on that particular piece, so we went from Bach, where he's got these four he's weaving four lines of music together very intricately, and now Beethoven, he's got just one line of music, and he's adding all of this harmony and sound underneath it. So it's a pretty substantial shift from what Bach was doing, but the harmony that Bach created is still the foundation. Not Bach didn't create that harmony. The harmony that Bach and his predecessors formulated is still the foundation for what Beethoven's writing. And we end up with Chopin here. So again, it's a melody with these chords under it, very much like what Beethoven was just doing, but completely different style. And again, the same chords Bach was using. And then we'll jump into the future, and I'm genuinely curious what your reaction to this is. 5 Pieces by Anton Webern. That's enough to get an idea for it. So yeah, I'm just curious what your reaction is.
Sounds like a soundtrack to a Scooby-Doo
Yeah.
episode. Not something like wedding song.
It's not music I would choose to listen to.
Right. Yeah.
My reaction is, I also can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair. Right?
Just a guess I'm guessing he's getting it like wrong, like as much on purpose in as many different ways on purpose, kind of like system mastery by showing like it's like if you can get 100 on a test or 0 on a test, but either one would necessitate doing that consistently means you can't.
Means you do know what you're doing, right?
What you're doing, yeah.
That's an interesting way to think about it. Okay. Well, so I'll explain what he's trying to do. This guy. This guy is Anton Webern, and this was the first Viennese school. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, great composers from Vienna. And in the early part of the 1900s, these guys decided that they were the second Viennese school. And notice Webern's over there on the right. So this is Arnold Schoenberg, Anton Berg, and Alban Berg and Anton Webern. Schoenberg actually, in 1933, he was on vacation in Paris. Nazis took over where he was, his home, and so he's Jewish. He was Jewish, and so he was warned not to come back to Vienna, and he tried to get to England. It didn't work out. He ended up in the United States. And he taught at USC and UCLA right here. So now USC and UCLA actually both have a Schoenberg Hall. But what these guys were doing is they were doing 12-tone music. Not all of them all the time, but one of the things that probably the thing they're most famous for is 12-tone music. So remember those ratios where there's this very distinctive hierarchy that's built into our brains. And what they were trying to do was just delete that hierarchy. They wanted every note to be just as important as every other note. And they thought that that's the direction music was headed. So if you look at that little bit of history that we just watched, one of the things that you'll notice if you analyze that is that dissonance was used a little differently and a little more frequently in some of the more modern styles. And so they said, well, this is the way music is progressing historically. This is the trajectory of music. We're just going to take it to its ultimate conclusion and make all notes the same and delete the hierarchy. And now we just have, this is what music should be. This is where we've been headed for centuries. Let's just do it. And that was the result. So... Well, okay, so funny. I think the funniest music recording I've ever heard was actually of a performance of something written by John Cage. John Cage you might have heard of 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. That was Cage's piece. He didn't do anything. And orchestras will actually sit there with blank music for 4 minutes and 33 seconds performing John Cage's piece. So there was an old LP at the library where I did my grad school, and it was half an hour long. The first half was horrible music, and the second half, the audience got tired of it. They started clapping so that the performers would stop, and the performers kept going, and so the audience continued clapping for 15 minutes. And you can't hear the performance, and it's actually better that way. And someone who thought he wanted to solve this problem. This is Charles Seeger, and you might some of the people in here might remember the Weavers from the 50s. Pete Seeger was Charles' son. Pete Seeger was in the Weavers, and I think all of Charles Seeger's kids ended up being folk musicians. He's considered the father of ethnomusicology by some people who are ethnomusicologists. And Charles Seeger, what he wanted to do was well, he wanted to save modern music. He said it's getting very just diffuse and it's not communicating anything relevant. It's not, and so he said we've missed the point with dissonance. He said we've taken one aspect of music, which is the pitch, and we've made that dissonant, but we've failed to create a dissonant foundation for music. He said there's a lot of aspects to music other than pitch. There's rhythm, there's volume, there's timbre, the sound quality, and other things. And so he proposed making everything dissonant and creating a foundation. And these people actually thought that they could educate humanity to appreciate this kind of music. And anyway, so he wrote this manual of dissonant counterpoint to explain how to create a dissonant foundation for music. And his student, who later became his wife, Ruth Crawford, she wrote this. I really like the piece. It's brilliant. It's not something I would listen to relax, but just thinking about it intellectually, what she did with the piece is really cool. But it's more of an intellectual. It's something to nerd out about rather than like peacefully relax to. She was very self-critical, and unfortunately, she wrote a lot of really interesting pieces, and most of them she destroyed herself because she didn't feel confident about it. But the string quartet is something that we do have from her, and I'll play it for you. And it's not something that you'd sit and relax to, but. So notice that the rhythm is hard to follow. And also, you can't tell what key it's in. And if I asked you to hum that back, you probably couldn't hum it back to me. I couldn't even hum it back to you. And I sat down and studied this thing for hours. But what I discovered studying this particular piece of music, which was designed specifically to be built on a completely dissonant foundation, was that ultimately it failed. I would say that this piece was a success. It succeeded at being an interesting piece of music that intellectual curiosity, yeah. But as far as being where it failed was that it did not. It actually didn't make dissonance the foundation. She was only able to dissonate, to use Charles Seeger's words. Maybe he had 7 aspects of music and he wanted all of them dissonant, and she was only able to dissonate maybe 2 at a time, and the other 5 stayed consonant. So in one movement she would dissonate 2 things like rhythm and something else, and in another movement she would dissonate 2 other things, and it made for, again, intellectual curiosity. But what was interesting was that even just to have the intellectual curiosity there, even to have enough music there for it to be an intellectual curiosity, it still had to have a consonant foundation. And so that tells me that these mathematical ratios, they're not something that we can really educate out of ourselves. I think it's something that God put in there, and that all of this music is ultimately an attempt to circumvent the order that God actually designed when he designed our ability to make and appreciate music. So I'm not saying that Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, and Charles Seeger were intentionally trying to fight God on that point, but I do think that the entire enterprise of modern music is trying to fight God-given order. So a couple of takeaways from this is that, so again, even the best attempts to upend consonant foundation has failed. But more interestingly, I really think that whatever you study, you will find God's signature in it. Literally anything, I think you'll find God's signature in it. Like I was actually pretty surprised to get hit in the face with this when I was studying music composition. It was, I don't know, it was just really interesting. I wasn't expecting to see divinely ordained order right there, and then this century-long attempt to defeat that order. And I'm sure that whatever area of study you choose, if you're open to that, you'll find something interesting.